In Pergamum, sex was not merely desire, it was liturgy. In the temples of Dionysus, religious festivals ended in collective ecstasy where bodies mingled without distinction. In the Asclepion, the most famous healing center of the ancient world, patients slept in underground chambers, awaiting visions of the serpent god, and the purification rituals included practices no Christian could accept. Throughout the entire city, sacred prostitution was as normal as going to the market. And in the middle of all this, a small church was trying to keep its members away from the wrong beds. It was losing. To understand how seduction nearly swallowed that community of faith, you first need to understand where it was planted. Pergamum was no ordinary city. It was the capital of the Roman province of Asia. It sat atop a hill 335 meters high in the northwest of modern-day Turkey, 26 kilometers from the Aegean Sea. For more than 200 years, it served as the administrative seat of the entire region. The population, at the height of the Roman period, reached approximately 200,000 people. And when Rome decided to create the first official center of imperial worship in the East, it did not choose Ephesus. It did not choose Smyrna. It chose Pergamum. Since 29 BC, a temple dedicated to Rome and Emperor Augustus had been operating there. Then came the temples to Trajan and Severus. Each new emperor meant more altars, more priests, more festivals, and more pressure on anyone who refused to participate. But the imperial cult was only one layer of the problem. Pergamum was a city built upon religion. Temples to Zeus, Athena, Demeter, Dionysus, and Asclepius spread from the Acropolis down to the valley. The great altar of Zeus, a monumental structure with a base of 36 by 33 meters, decorated with a frieze 113 meters long and 2 meters and 30 centimeters high, depicting the battle between the Olympian gods and giants, dominated the southern terrace of the Acropolis. It was the second largest surviving frieze of antiquity, behind only the Parthenon in Athens. Many scholars believe this altar is exactly what Christ called Satan's throne in Revelation chapter 2, verse 13. Others point to the imperial cult. Still others to the Asclepion, where the god of healing was represented by a serpent. The same symbol the biblical text associates with the enemy since Genesis chapter 3. Whatever the exact reference, the point is that Pergamum concentrated so much idolatry that Christ himself identified it as the city where Satan dwelt, not as metaphor, as address. And it was at this address that Christians woke up every day. Put into perspective what it meant to be a Christian in Pergamum at the end of the first century. You did not live in a separate neighborhood. You had no safe zone. The city's economy was tied to the temples. The guilds and trade associations, the equivalent of modern unions, held their meetings inside spaces dedicated to pagan deities. If you were a blacksmith, tanner, weaver, potter, carpenter, or fabric merchant, it did not matter. Your trades meeting took place in a temple or in a hall annexed to a temple. And these meetings were not merely work assemblies. They began with a libation, wine poured on the ground in honor of the patron god of the guild. Then came the formal offering, then the banquet. The meat served had been sacrificed to idols. The wine was dedicated to a deity, and as the night progressed, the banquet transformed. The music changed tone. Dances connected to fertility cults circulated among the guests. Women and men, associated with ritual prostitution in the temples, appeared as a natural part of the celebration. What began as a business dinner ended as a ritual of collective sexual immorality. Refusing the invitation was not merely a matter of conscience, it was economic suicide. If you did not attend your trade guild meetings, you lost access to contracts, you lost work referrals, you lost clients who only did business within the association circuit. In many cases, you were expelled from the guild entirely, and without a guild, working as an artisan or merchant in Pergamum became practically impossible. No one hired an artisan who did not belong to any guild. The pressure did not come with a sword. It came with a smile. It came with an invitation. It came with the phrase every Christian in Pergamum had already heard dozens of times, "It's just a banquet." But it was not just a banquet. The festivals dedicated to Dionysus were the visible apex of this culture of seduction. Dionysus, called Cathegemon, the guide, was the principal god of the Attalid dynasty that had governed Pergamum before the Romans. His marble temple stood at the northern end of the theatre terrace, built on a podium 4.5 meters above terrace level, with a facade of 4 Ionic columns and access via a staircase of 25 steps. The theatre beside it, the steepest in the entire ancient world, held 10,000 spectators, and on festival days, that entire complex transformed into a scene of celebration with no defined boundary between the religious and the sexual. The Dionysian festivals were famous throughout the Greco-Roman world for the complete dissolution of social norms. Men and women, free and enslaved, rich and poor, all mingled under the effect of consecrated wine and hypnotic music. Religious ecstasy was indistinguishable from orgy, and for the local culture, this was not deviation. It was devotion. The more intense the abandonment, the deeper the communion with the god. Now add another layer. The Asclepion of Pergamum stood 3 kilometers southwest of the Acropolis, connected to the city by a colonnaded sacred road 820 meters long. It was one of the most celebrated healing centers of the ancient world, part of a network of more than 200 sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius spread across the Mediterranean. The Asclepion of Pergamum was so famous that Galen, the most renowned physician of the Roman Empire and personal doctor to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, worked there for years. Patients came from across the entire Mediterranean basin, seeking treatment for diseases that conventional medicine of the era could not resolve. At the entrance of the sanctuary, an inscription warned, "It is forbidden to die in the Asclepion." This was not humor, it was deliberate psychological strategy. Those who were terminally ill or about to give birth were not admitted, to maintain the illusion that no one died inside and that the gods truly healed. The treatment process began with ritual purification. The patient wore white robes, a symbol of ceremonial cleanliness. They washed in the water of the sanctuary's sacred spring, a spring that, incidentally, still flows water to this day at the archaeological site. Then they offered sacrifices to the god. In the shops along the sacred road, vendors offered votive items and animals for sacrifice. An entire commerce revolved around illness and hope. After the sacrifices, the patient was led to underground chambers called the abaton, dark rooms where they were to sleep and dream, awaiting a vision of Asclepius. Domesticated serpents, symbols of the god, associated with regeneration because of their skin shedding, were kept inside the sanctuary and circulated freely among the sleeping patients. In the morning, the priest-physicians interpreted the dreams and prescribed treatment. The list of treatments included thermal baths, massages, clay application, use of medicinal herbs, hydrotherapy, primitive psychotherapy, and even minor surgeries. The mixture of pagan spirituality and medical practice was total and inseparable. Healing the body and devotion to the serpent god were understood as one and the same thing. And the purification rituals frequently included communal baths, procedures involving physical contact between priests and patients, and practices that crossed the line between therapy and ritualized intimacy. For a Christian living in Pergamum, every corner presented a trap. Going to the market meant passing by meat sacrificed to idols at practically every stall. Participating in economic life meant attending corporate banquets that ended in sexual immorality. Seeking medical treatment meant submitting to pagan rituals at the Asclepion. Even entertainment was contaminated. The theater served as a stage for religious festivals where Dionysus was celebrated with wine and bodies. There was no neutral space. Idolatry and immorality were sewn into the fabric of daily life like threads you could not remove without unraveling the entire garment. And it was precisely in this scenario that something even more dangerous than external pressure emerged. Christ's letter to Pergamum, recorded in Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 through 17, begins with a commendation. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. The commendation is genuine. The church had resisted persecution. It had upheld the name of Christ, even when it cost the life of at least one of its own. Antipas, the only Christian from Pergamum, whose name the Bible records, was killed for refusing to participate in the imperial cult. Later Christian traditions say he was placed inside a bronze vessel shaped like a bull and roasted alive inside the city's theater. According to those same traditions, he had been ordained bishop of Pergamum by the Apostle John himself, just as Polycarp was ordained bishop of Smyrna. The historical reliability of these specific accounts is debated among scholars, but what is certain is that Antipas died as a martyr, that his death occurred in Pergamum, and that the event was still fresh in the community's memory when John recorded the vision, around the year 96 AD. The Greek word used to describe Antipas, martyrs, is the same word used to describe Christ himself in Revelation chapter 1, verse 5. Witness, faithful. Someone who paid with their life the price of not denying the truth. The church of Pergamum resisted the sword, but it was not resisting the bed. Right after the commendation, the letter shifts tone. But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Revelation chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. The accusation is twofold: the teaching of Balaam and the teaching of the Nicolaitans, and both point to the same problem: sexual immorality disguised as spiritual freedom. To understand the weight of this accusation, you need to go back to the book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 25. The context is the end of Israel's 40 years of wandering in the desert. The people are camped in the plains of Moab, about to cross the Jordan and enter the promised land. Balak, king of Moab, is terrified. Israel's army had just destroyed the Amorite kings Sihon and Og and everything in their path. Balak knew he could not win on the battlefield. So he hired Balaam, a famous diviner who lived on the banks of the Euphrates River, to curse Israel from a distance. The plan was simple. If God withdrew his protection, the army of Israel would lose the supernatural power that made it invincible. But the plan failed. 3 times Balaam set up altars, sacrificed animals, and opened his mouth to curse. 3 times God turned the curse into a blessing. Balak was furious. He spent resources, he wasted time, and he could not get a single word of curse against Israel. Then Balaam offered a devastating alternative, recorded later in Numbers chapter 31, verse 16. Instead of cursing from the outside, he corrupted from within. Balaam advised Balak to send Moabite and Midianite women to the Israelite camp. Not with weapons, not with armies, with invitations, parties, food sacrificed to the gods of Moab, wine, and beds. It worked with brutal efficiency. Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 3, records the result. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor. The pattern is surgical. First the invitation, then the banquet, then the sacrificed meat, then the sex, then the worship of false gods. Each step led to the next with calculated naturalness. No Israelite left his tent saying, "Today I'm going to abandon the God who parted the sea for me." They went to a party, they ate, they drank, and when the night wore on, they were in beds they should never have occupied. And the next morning, they were kneeling before Baal of Peor. 24,000 Israelites died in the plague God sent as a consequence, without battle, without an invading army, without a military siege, without a single sword drawn by the enemy, just a strategy of sexual seduction executed with surgical precision. The most efficient weapon ever used against the people of God had no blade. It had perfume. And when Christ accuses the church of Pergamum of harboring the teaching of Balaam, he is saying the same method was operating there, not as a vague historical repetition, as an identical tactic applied to a new context. The Moabite women were replaced by the banquets of the trade guilds and the festivals in the temples. The meat sacrificed to Baal of Peor was replaced by the meat sacrificed to Zeus, Asclepius, Dionysus, and the deified emperor. The plains of Moab were replaced by the banquet halls in the temples of Pergamum. The wine of Shittim was replaced by the wine consecrated in Dionysian rituals. But the mechanism was the same: seduction that begins at the table and ends in the bed. The teaching of the Nicolaitans, mentioned right after in the letter, seems to have been a practical extension of this same problem. The Bible does not give a detailed definition of Nicolaitism. The word appears only twice in the entire New Testament, here and in the letter to Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2, verse 6, where Christ says he hates the works of the Nicolaitans. But the context and the direct connection to the teaching of Balaam in the same sentence indicates that the Nicolaitans advocated a position of moral compromise with pagan culture, specifically regarding sacrificial food and sexual immorality. The logic they offered was seductive because it started from premises that seemed biblical. If idols are not real gods, as Paul taught in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, then eating meat sacrificed to them is irrelevant. If the grace of Christ is sufficient to cover every sin, then participating in pagan festivals does not compromise salvation. If the body is merely temporary matter that will be destroyed, then what you do with it does not affect the eternal spirit. This line of reasoning turned every concession into an act of faith, every moral compromise into a demonstration of spiritual freedom, and every wrong bed into a matter irrelevant to eternity. The problem is that Christ disagreed. The letter does not treat the presence of the Nicolaitans as a minor theological divergence that could be resolved through conversation. It treats it as an existential threat. Repent, therefore, if not, I will come to you soon and war against them with the sword of my mouth. Revelation chapter 2, verse 16. The sword, the same symbol with which Christ introduces himself at the beginning of the letter, the one who has the sharp, two-edged sword, is not a metaphor for pastoral dialogue. It is an instrument of judgment. And the threat is twofold: against those who practice and against the church that tolerates. This is the detail that changes everything in the Pergamum narrative. Christ does not accuse only the individuals who attended the banquets and slept in the temples. He accuses the entire congregation for tolerating those who did. The Greek expression used suggests the church had full knowledge of the practices, knew who was involved, and chose not to confront. Perhaps out of fear of losing members, perhaps out of personal sympathy, perhaps because those who practiced were influential, articulate, financially important to the community, perhaps because confronting meant dividing the church, and after losing Antipas, The last thing they wanted was to lose more people. The text does not reveal the reason for the tolerance. It reveals only that it existed, and that Christ considered it unacceptable. Consider the human cost of this scenario. You are a Christian in Pérgamo. You have already seen a brother executed for refusing to say, "Caesar is Lord." You have already felt the weight of being excluded from trade associations. You have already lost contracts because you do not attend the guild banquets. Your Greek neighbor participates in the Dionysus festivals every season and prospers. Your fellow tradesman goes to the Asclepion regularly and returns saying he was healed by the intervention of the serpent god. And within your own faith community, the only support network you have, there are articulate voices saying that participating in these things is not betrayal. It is wisdom. God understands the pressure. Grace covers it. The body is just matter. It makes no sense to suffer over food and parties when salvation is guaranteed. Which side do you choose when the pressure comes not with a death threat, but with the promise of an easier life? That was the question every Christian in Pérgamo faced daily. And the letter reveals that some were choosing the wrong side. Not through sudden weakness, through gradual erosion. The first banquet is the hardest to accept. The second is already easier. By the third, the sacrificed meat no longer troubles the conscience. By the fourth, the consecrated wine no longer seems different from any other wine. And when the night advances and bodies draw close and the music changes rhythm, the resistance that seemed unshakable 3 months ago has already dissolved 3 invitations ago. Fornication never starts in the bed. It starts at the table. And there is another aspect that the Pérgamo narrative exposes with brutal clarity. Sexual immorality in the pagan temples was not accidental. It was theological. It was intentional. It was part of the worship system. In the cult of Dionysus, sexual ecstasy was understood as communion with the divine. The more intense the abandonment of the senses, the deeper the religious experience. In the cult of Aphrodite, widely practiced throughout the Asia Minor region and with direct influence in Pérgamo, sacred prostitutes called hierodulai served in the temples as mediators between humans and gods. In the fertility rituals connected to Demeter, whose sanctuary in Pérgamo had seating for 800 initiates, the mysteries included rites of passage with explicit sexual connotation that participants swore never to reveal. Sex was not the accidental byproduct of a party that got out of control. It was the objective of the ritual. The consummation of the physical act was understood as the consummation of the act of worship. For a Christian to participate in these practices, it was not enough to ignore the conscience. It was necessary to accept an alternative theology. One that said the body and the spirit are sealed compartments, that what happens in the flesh does not contaminate the soul. That freedom in Christ includes the freedom to use the body as an instrument of any experience without spiritual consequence. The Nicolaitans offered exactly this theology. Elegant, sophisticated, adapted to Christian vocabulary, and profoundly attractive because it solved the practical problem of living in Pérgamo without suffering social and economic exclusion. But the letter destroys this theology with a single historical reference. Balaam, the man who discovered that the most efficient way to defeat the people of God was not to attack from outside with armies, but to seduce from within with invitations. And the consequence of that seduction was not temporary spiritual discomfort. It was 24,000 bodies on the ground of the plains of Moab. Christ was not being poetic when he made this comparison. He was being surgical. When he compares what was happening in Pérgamo to what happened in Shittim, he is saying the consequence will be proportional. That tolerance of sexual immorality within the community of faith is not a matter of theological opinion. It is a matter of spiritual life and death. And that the sword he holds is not decorative. The letter also reveals something about the nature of sexual temptation in a spiritual context that goes far beyond the first century. In Pergamum, sex was not offered as open rebellion against God. It was offered as cultural integration. Participating in the banquets and fertility rituals was not presented as an act of disobedience. It was presented as an act of responsible citizenship, of good neighborliness, of social and professional maturity. The temptation did not arrive with the smell of sulfur. It arrived with the smell of sophisticated food, the sound of refined music, and the company of influential and successful people. And this made it infinitely more dangerous than any declared persecution. Persecution makes clear who the enemy is. Seduction blurs that line until it disappears completely. Pergamum had both operating at the same time: the sword that killed Antipas and the banquet that seduced the survivors. And the letter shows that Christ considered the second threat more urgent than the first. The commendation for resisting persecution occupies one verse. The rebuke for tolerating immorality occupies 3. And the ultimatum comes right after: repent, or the sword of Christ will go into action. Not against the Roman persecutors outside, against those who sat in the congregation's pews in the morning and at the pagan temple's tables at night. The story of Pergamum must also be read against the intellectual backdrop of the city. Pergamum housed the second largest library of the ancient world, second only to Alexandria in Egypt. More than 200,000 manuscript scrolls were catalogued there. It was the people of Pergamum who developed parchment, animal skins treated and polished to receive writing, when Egypt cut off the supply of papyrus out of rivalry with the local library. The very word parchment comes directly from the name of the city. Philosophers debated in the Agora. Physicians innovated at the Asclepion. Sculptors created works in the style that became known as the School of Pergamum, famous for the dramatic and emotional intensity of its figures. The cultural sophistication was immense. Pergamum was not a city of barbarians who indulged in vices out of ignorance. It was a first-rate center of civilization that integrated ritual immorality within an intellectual and artistic framework that made it respectable. And it is precisely this detail that makes the seduction more understandable and more devastating. In less sophisticated cities, pagan immorality could seem crude, primitive, easy to reject for anyone with a minimum of moral formation. In Pergamum, it came wrapped in culture, in art, in philosophy, in medical science. The banquets where sacrificed meat was served did not take place in dark and dirty alleys. They took place in halls with white marble columns, detailed frescoes on the walls, musicians playing lyre and double flute, and slaves serving elaborate dishes on imported pottery. Ritual prostitution in the temples was not presented as a street vice. It was presented as an elevated spiritual experience, reserved for the initiated, connected to ancestral mysteries that promised revelation, healing, and direct contact with the divine. How do you resist sin when it dresses itself in civilization and speaks the language of wisdom? That is the question Pergamum poses, and it has never been answered easily. The poorest Christians in the congregation probably had an easier time resisting the seduction of the banquets, not because they were more spiritual, but because they had fewer invitations, less access, less economic pressure to attend the guild events. It was the Christians with their own businesses, with intermediate social standing, with active commercial connections, who faced the maximum pressure. Every trade guild meeting was a choice between faithfulness and providing for the family. Every public festival was a test of endurance that lasted hours, with constant social pressure from colleagues who did not understand the refusal. And the teaching of the Nicolaitans was especially attractive to these Christians because it offered a solution that preserved faith and prosperity at the same time. You could remain a Christian and keep attending the banquets. You could pray to Christ in the morning and dine at the temple of Zeus at night. You could maintain your spiritual identity without paying the social and economic price that separation demanded. The letter reveals that this solution was a lie that led to death, but it also reveals that the lie was working. Christ does not rebuke something that has already been resolved. He rebukes something that is ongoing. The tolerance was active and conscious. Those who practiced the teaching of Balaam and the Nicolaitans were not former members who had left the church. They were members. They were among you, as the text records. They attended the congregation's meetings. They sang the same hymns. They heard the same teachings. They shared the same communion table. And then they went to the pagan banquets and to the temple beds. This was the real scandal of Pergamum. Not that the city was immoral, because every pagan city of the first century was immoral. The scandal was that the city's immorality had penetrated the church and was being tolerated by those who knew, and the church knew. The expression, "you have there some who hold," indicates a known and unconfronted presence. It was not secret infiltration that nobody noticed. It was a coexistence tolerated by collective decision. The Church of Pergamum had decided, consciously or through progressive omission, that the unity of the community was more important than the purity of doctrine. That keeping people inside was more of a priority than confronting what they did outside. That silence in the face of moral compromise was preferable to the open conflict that would divide the congregation. Christ called this grounds for immediate judgment. The letter is one of 7 sent to the churches of the province of Asia at the beginning of the book of Revelation. Each carries a specific diagnosis adapted to the local reality. Ephesus had abandoned its first love. Smyrna faced persecution and extreme poverty. Thyatira tolerated a false prophetess the text calls Jezebel. Another direct reference to sexual seduction and idolatry combined as a strategy of internal destruction. Sardis was spiritually dead despite the appearance of life. Philadelphia was faithful despite having little strength. Laodicea was lukewarm, neither hot nor cold. Pergamum was compromised, not through involuntary weakness, but through a deliberate choice not to face the problem. It chose to tolerate the intolerable in the name of something that seemed reasonable, practical, and even compassionate. And Christ's response to this choice is an offer that functions as an inverted mirror of everything Pergamum offered. In the Roman world, when a defendant was tried and acquitted, they received a white stone. It was the vote of innocence. When someone was invited to an exclusive banquet, they received a stone with a name engraved on it. It was the ticket. In the letter to Pergamum, Christ promises exactly this to the one who overcomes, a white stone with a new name that only the one who receives it knows. The irony is surgical. In Pergamum, Christians were being seduced into attending pagan banquets that ended in fornication. Christ offers another banquet, another invitation, another identity. The hidden manna instead of the meat sacrificed to idols, the white stone instead of the ticket to the temples, a new name instead of the dirty reputation the festivals left behind. Pergamum reveals that seduction always offers a cheap version of what God offers for free, and that fornication, whether physical, spiritual, or moral, always begins with the same phrase, "It's not that serious." The letter says it is, and the one who wrote the letter is the one who holds the two-edged sword.